what the next billion is now expecting is actually those fundamental principles applied with an amount of consistency, with an amount of finesse. The tightrope balance I'm talking about here is that you don't want to patronize a user. People are not fundamentally stupid.
I was, in my head, I was just thinking this. I was like, there's that KISS principle that
I think after a point, you kind of start actually getting along with the ends.
I know how much we disagreed initially on so
I
many
think we got along
aspects.
after, but the whole point is as things grew, you agreed, right? As opposed to money spent.
So it led to less.
Basically, the money leaving you as opposed to the fact that I have budgeted this much. It's a simple semantics thing.
Yeah.
It's just semantics. Let's take a British example. I have a Monzo account, and with Monzo, it is a British banking, neo-banking. They've already kind of like gone so further into that process of thinking about the product. Mine taught me a phrase a while ago, which is when something's a bubblegum anything, a bubblegum blank. So bubblegum design, you chew it, after a point it loses flavor, you have to spit it out, get a new piece. So.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Behind the Feature. Today we're actually joined by Alad Joshi, a principal design at Canvas. I'm supremely excited about the episode today because we're going to get to deep dive into how does design process work, what's happening with the new design trends, the next billion users, how do you design for them? And we also dive a bit into payments today with him. So he comes with a very rich experience from designing, prototyping to everything in between. So whether you're a designer, product manager, or just interested, there's something for everybody in today's episode. So definitely tune in, watch till the end. We have a great rapid fire round with some very interesting insights. I'm pretty excited today, Alad. For a lot of people who don't know, Alad and I worked together when I was at Aditya Birla Health Insurance. He helped me design the whole onboarding journey and the gamification elements. So today's pretty exciting. Thank you so much for taking out time to chat with me, Alad. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your own journey as a principal design manager at Canvas?
Sure. So I think I'll focus more on the Canvas side of things. My journey is not as eventful as I think the work I've done here. The past 4 years, I've spent my time essentially working as a principal designer and design manager in the team. And essentially what that's entailed is us working across some pretty fantastic partners on getting not just their design problem solved, but also other things that elevate from that problem statement, like a design operations, design system thinking, actually going into the weeds of how do I improve the design maturity of the organization.
Okay.
And that's at the end of the day, the larger goal is also how do you talk the talk with the teams that you're working with as opposed to just provide pixels. So that's been the past 4 years in a nutshell. My personal journey as a designer has been rather uneventful. I've been in the arts and design space for a long time. At some point, I realized it was lucrative to convert this into a digital design career as opposed to sticking to analogous art or what I was originally trained in, which is industrial design.
Okay.
Nothing crazy, very analogous shifts.
Okay, that's great. So, Alad, I want you to help us today to first understand this world of UI, UX, and to begin that journey, I want you to just explain to us the difference between UI and UX because there's a lot of misconceptions out there.
Okay, so I think what I'm going to provide is our organizational understanding of it.
Okay.
Which is that it's all UX.
It's all UX.
Yeah. And then there are many subsets to it.
Okay.
So there's obviously your core understanding of how something will work, how something goes from A to B. That's just core user flows. And that's what people consider in the general space UX, right? How does the flow work? What are the ends and odds and ends to it? What are the corners? What are the failures? Within that comes in elements that feed into the UX. One of them being the interface.
Okay.
Don Norman has said it himself. If something looks good, you're going to trust it more. It's a law of UX of sorts. We don't like to stay dogmatic about this stuff, but the whole point is that if something looks good, you're going to trust it, which then by nature makes the interface or how it looks, that's the definition of the user interface. It makes it a part of the experience. So I think how at least we have come to collectively perceive it at Canvas is that it's a joint conversation. It's not two separate items. It's actually one exists within the other. So interface exists within the tent of user experience. Other things also then fall into place under that, into the UX side of things. So under UX, you have flows, you have the interface, which is how it looks. You also have things like content and copy. Copy then becomes a part of the user experience.
Yes.
You have to look at this in a more traditionalistic sense, like how a customer experience person would look at it, that everything falls into a customer experience. How does the plant make me feel? How are the queues organized at a store or at the bank teller. It's the same stuff. Everything else feeds into the X, which is the experience.
The
factor.
user experience. Would it be possible for you to share an example, whether at Canvas or from any of your previous experience, on how do you design, how do you start the design journey and the process?
All right. So let's take an example of a product that's already kind of existed in the market, or there are competitor businesses. So let's take that as the hypothetical.
Okay.
The best thing to do in a situation like this is, notwithstanding your own research, first hand, second hand, or otherwise, you also want to shamelessly imitate.
Are you going to take us through a product example?
I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
The thing is, one thing we've worked on a lot is payments, for instance, right?
Okay.
Or even things like accounts and deposits. When you look at other players who've been working on this for a decade plus in the digital space, notwithstanding the issues those platforms have, because India has its fair share of issues across the digital design space, you can still see what fundamentally operates for users. You can still see what fundamentally is a hit, essentially what works out, what pans out well. You want to first and foremost get a list of everything that's panning out. And that involves a deep amount of second-hand research of just the competitors.
Okay.
Right? It's something that I feel like there is a lot to be said on first-hand user research. There's a lot to be said about things like, closed user group testing, open testing with betas, all that kind of stuff. But you want to understand what's already working. That's the best and most low-cost way as an individual to figure out, I need this in my piece. You can always elevate it, work on it, and then take that into first-hand testing. But always important to first start with imitation. Best way of kind of understanding what's working. From there, you then kind of create your variant one of whatever the design is. One really important part now, and one thing we've been doing at the company a fair bit, actually, we've been like really relying on it in our kind of first window of design, is really deeply prototyping a piece out as much as you can. So if like a payments module, for instance, we've designed multiple payments modules where we've actually gone in and prototyped entire flows out such that it almost feels like a full-fledged product.
Okay.
Right? And that becomes really important. Being able to not just visualize it, but actually experience your way through the entire piece has two interesting effects. One, it gives you a viable piece to put out to test, right? And the other one is, as a designer, there's an amount of self-awareness that you're able to achieve through viewing a prototype that you wouldn't have through still image. There is just something fundamentally realistic in going through the piece. And if you can add motion design to it, even better. Then you're able to really understand what the hell's going on.
Okay.
So you go into the prototyping. Then from there is when reality hits. And then you go through the whole thing of a closed user group test. You go through maybe your first-hand tests with an open group. Start understanding where things don't work. More often than not, you'll find a lot of things that don't work, which is totally normal. And they may range from things like content and copy to a color here and there to a flow here and there. Correct things on there, and then it's just an earnest attempt at fixing things till you go live. So
I think that's very well put. So just gonna summarize it, do a competition benchmarking and study. As you said, it's okay to imitate.
It's encouraged.
It's encouraged to imitate.
Encouraged.
Okay. The second piece that you mentioned was definitely prototyping with tools like Figma.
That's the great thing. Figma is extremely zealous about the prototyping. An entire business department of theirs is the prototyping team. It's not just a product team, it's a business team they have.
Right.
So they have an entire dedicated engineering and design team for just that.
Okay. Alad, you did mention prototyping, and it's interesting. Can you also share with us what are some of the tools that you use for prototyping?
There were other third-party tools that worked, but the thing is they have really doubled down on making the prototyping tool way stronger. That's the reason why Google uses it. That's the reason why now everyone's moved over to it. From what I know, I think even Apple has now moved over to Figma after a long stint with Sketch. So clearly, they've put so much money into it, and a lot of research and effort has gone into it to make it the best prototyping tool. So on the note of what the tool has enabled us with, is you're able to, and something I'm actually in my own team, the prototyping proponent of sorts. I do regular weekly or monthly sessions with the team. We have a couple other people who are really talented with this stuff in the team. And what we've realized is the tool's getting more and more powerful. And all that means, in a simple sense, is that you're able to make something that looks close to reality. There is a realism in the prototypes you're able to make. If you think back to InVision days, when you had to get onto another third-party tool, upload PNGs or JPEGs, and then the clicks kind of just in a jagged way took you from one to the next.
Yes.
We've gone a long way. We've gone through many layers of evolution from then, where you're able to actually transition a screen from one to the next. You're able to show page sweeps. A drawer is able to move up and down. The realism has increased, which means you can now actually evaluate for yourself multiple things. If I had to summarize them, there'd be a couple. Like one, do I need to put in the front end effort that I need for this? Because front end efforts cost money.
Correct.
Do I want to back it up with that front end effort? Is this accessible? That's another big one that we're starting to come across now. Motion and motion design can be very inaccessible for people with who are differently abled or people who have neurodivergences. And finally, at the design level, does this work? Does it function for what I'm trying to do here? Is there something I could have done in an alternative way? That's actually maybe the first point I should have said, because that becomes kind of the primary point before you move to other stakeholders or pieces. So yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell how we've been using Figma and the benefits it's given us at a prototyping level. And I would highly recommend any designer out there be enabled with understanding how to prototype at a fundamental level with some amount of motion. It's actually something that we are trying to get every associate and senior designer in the team to get accustomed with. And I'd recommend, if you're getting into it, don't just go design first. Also go in with a prototyping sense.
I think that's terrific insight. The third insight that you actually shared during the design process was the user, when you actually go out and you do the beta and you do an open group testing.
Yep.
Can you also share some of the, can we deep dive into this piece and
sure.
you can share some of the examples of how you go about it?
Absolutely. So there is one client, one pretty large client we're working with right now who have just recently launched a kind of super app of sorts.
Okay.
And one thing that they were pretty zealously doing through the entire process was a lot of CUG, a lot of closed user group testing. They're obviously doing a lot of testing now that they're live, but they spent a lot of time on each module very, very religiously, taking the prototypes we made. And it still happens actually. We still have new features, new modules going into closed user group testing, where they took the prototypes and they were actually able to test out a lot of points about the design that potentially were a problem point or things that worked. So of late, one thing that I've become a big proponent of is getting those 15 people together.
Where do you find these closed user groups? What are some of the platforms?
That you have to kind of go through socials.
Okay.
In the case of what I've seen them do, is they've gone in through, in some cases, hiring platforms. People who are looking for a quick side hustle, a quick side job, because you also do in some cases get paid to do the task. The best closed user groups also are the kind of the unpaid ones where they just want to test something out.
Right.
So you signal boost as much as you can and you find groups of 15 and you find separate groups. You obviously try to separate this out. You try to make sure you have enough variety and variance in the actual individual that's in the group, and then you hand out these prototypes. It's hard to control whether they actually have things like Figma Mirror on their phone, so that's the only kind of drawback. It's like a web experience. If you're trying to do an app, that can be tough.
Right.
But nonetheless, you get the experience out. You're able to find the visceral, fundamental responses of the user, and that's the kind of stuff you're looking for in the start. It's like the visceral response. That does something feel like it fundamentally doesn't work for you? Does something feel like it's really operating for you? And what are the other things that seem, BAU? And then from there, you start building out inferences. That's where PMs can come in really handy. Is because they'll come in with a completely clinical viewpoint of what needs to change, which is sometimes very annoying, sometimes, but more often than not really helpful. Notwithstanding how much you might get annoyed by this as a designer. But after that point, you then start to actually get to some sort of truth, right? It's not the ultimate one. The ultimate truth is when your product is live and you actually start seeing where there are drop-offs or where there are failures. But that kind of what we've seen, at least with this big client right now, has helped us attain some level of truth before you actually move to market. There's nothing more fulfilling than that, I would say. Okay. You actually feel some amount of, I think, facing a reality, getting over it, and then moving into live, particularly on really fast-paced products, that is a really, I think, rewarding thing that a lot of designers shy away from at first, but you start to realize that that's like the secret sauce that you really want. So yeah, that's what I'd say a recent example of one that's been going out testing wise.
I think that's pretty helpful. There was also another piece that you did mention was designing for different users.
Yeah.
I think that is something that a lot of app and digital platforms do struggle with, because how do you design for different kinds of users and entice them to engage on the platform?
Simplest way to look at this is to not complicate things for yourself. And how do you do that?
Yes.
You look at it in kind of metaphorical senses that you're only as strong as your weakest link. So you try to make things the simplest for the person who will have the toughest time there. Now, if this means more labeling on your buttons, right? So instead of just a chevron in a circle for a button to proceed, which is what you'll have in a lot of apps for younger people, because people know that that's the button to move ahead, you might need text labeling. In the case of a link style button, you might need the link text to be a little more descriptive than you're comfortable doing as a designer. You're breaking from the norm of what otherwise is that general thing of less, less, less. You might need more. That's not the only solution there. You also might need other kind of pictograms, imagery, iconography that work in a specific way. You might need detail pages to work in a certain way. You might need your fundamental text sizing to start off at a different level. And I'm not talking about accessibility stuff, I'm just talking about your actual design system. The tightrope balance I'm talking about here is that you don't want to patronize a user. People are not fundamentally stupid.
I was, in my head, I was just thinking this. I was like, there's that KISS principle that keeps running.
Yeah. So they're simple, but don't consider the person stupid.
Okay.
You're simplifying it, but there is a tightrope balance, and I think testing again helps figure out what exactly that knife edge is. Because you can end up hitting a place where you're pandering, and that ends up causing some actual problems in things like interface, like overloaded text. Looking at the lowest common denominator, but with the right nuance, with the right distancing from just pandering to a mass. I think something that big pet peeve for me is that you'll hear PMs telling you, hey Alhad, our user is like this. You don't know that. You don't necessarily know that all the time. You might need to treat the user with a little more respect and understand that there are certain elements they do need as a user, but there are also certain elements that you can pull back on.
So, Alad, there's this something interesting, and I remember this with my time working with you, and you keep alluding to PMs and designers and the relationship between them. A lot is usually spoken about PM and the relationship with the eng teams, but there's very little usually spoken about PMs and their conflicts with the design team.
I feel like we speak about it a lot, but also being designed. I think conflict with PM, I'm not speaking for every other designer, not even across the board or even in my own team.
Right.
I think after a point, you kind of start actually getting along with PMs.
I know how much we disagreed initially on so many
I think we got along
aspects.
but the whole point is as things grew, you agreed, right? I think the entire point is finding it's a human relationship at the end of the day. It's not a robotic
transactional
one. It's not. It's actually far from that, as much as it may feel like that at the get-go. But I think once you are able to find each other's wavelengths on what the goal is, and you will get a lot of blind spot from designers, you get a lot of blind spot from PMs as well.
Also.
Finding each other's blind spots, filling those in with the right kind of information. Once you get through that, I feel like they can actually end up being far closer than what is initially assumed. But the core of the relationship in the beginning can definitely feel a little bit antagonistic.
Yes. And
you could feel like the other person's at the other person's neck, which is, I would say, just a comedic opener to these relationships. So I think it definitely is because there are presuppositions a PM's coming with, there are presuppositions a designer's coming with, and sometimes one is more correct than the other from either party.
I think that's interesting. One of the other aspects that I want to talk to you about was design trends.
Sure.
I was actually kind of reading up 2024 design trends, and there are so many.
Yep.
What are some of the negative connotations of just following these trends blindly?
Okay.
And how can you actually use them effectively in your day-to-day work?
So is that you've immediately put a shelf life on what the thing is that you've created.
Okay.
The problem is that immediate shelf life problem means there's more resource that's going to go into this in a fixed amount of time. And with the way trends are moving right now, that shelf life is getting, I think, shorter and shorter. There was a pretty smart guy who I follow on Twitter, whose name I'm forgetting. I'll give you his handle, maybe we can put that into post. But he discusses visuals a lot. The guy is a very visual focused guy. He doesn't talk too much about user flows. He is interested in UX, but he talks about user interface, and he talks about it with a great amount of care and nuance. He said that even when you say something like skeuomorphic, neomorphic, as a trend or as a concept, the problem is you're limiting what that actual discussion is.
What does that mean?
So if you're talking about making things look realistic, so if you're trying to make a book, are you going to make an icon that's a flat version of a book? Or are you going to make a
3D,
kind of three-dimensional-esque?
Yeah.
Or are you going to actually just put a full-fledged 3D icon in there? It's not about whether you're going down a certain trend or a certain school of design. What are you trying to imitate? Are you trying to imitate realism? Are you trying to imitate impressionism? You're looking at it at a higher level. And that becomes a principle for not just that, but for the overarching product, because it then can also bleed into how your content and copy comes through in tonality, right? That, really good example is there is that sleek kind of flat illustration style Uber has and has always had now.
Yes.
Maybe like a better part of a decade. And they've always stuck to a very sleek conversation style. Those two things bleed into each other. The communication and conversation style, no matter which country they're in,
the tone and
tone
the
is
of the
sleek.
brand is then.
It's the white collar, black tie wearing kind of conversationalist. And they've stuck to that. And those two things come together quite well. It's a design system which, interestingly enough, they've barely changed for the longest time.
That's true.
Right? I recall them having the whole big icon and illustration upgrade, I can't remember now, 8-9 years ago. Maybe longer.
That's true, actually. Uber app is one of the few apps
stayed
that
the bloody same. Mine taught me a phrase a while ago, which is when something's a bubblegum anything, a bubblegum blank. So bubblegum design, you chew it, after a point it loses flavor, you just spit it out, get a new piece. So you don't want it to be that. You want it to actually have more depth to it. And that takes intellectual honesty. It takes really pondering the thought for a second before moving on, on the design.
I want to also now jump into designing for India and the next billion users.
Sure.
We, for the longest time, we aped the West when it comes to design. But now, what are some of the design principles that one should prioritize when they're designing for India market specifically?
So before I get into that, I kind of wanted to shed some light on the global economy of design and how it's been very different between the two hemispheres.
Okay.
When you look at something like the global north or the west, whatever direction you want to go, you've always had a lot more capital and availability of resource from the get-go, right? So, and let's keep that as the theme there. The global south, the east, whatever you want to call it, has always been in the scarcity camp.
Infrastructure constraints.
There's always a scarcity. So there's an abundance camp, there's a scarcity camp. Things are obviously now, since the start of digital design, things are very different. But how things started off in the West is you over leveraged on the design, you over leveraged for India is in a nascent space and in a growing one of a new era of design. So that next billion is also looking to better design. Its standards are improving.
Okay.
Even your fundamental enterprise platforms, your fundamental, let's just say, Kirane Ka Dukaan app, which they use for their UPI, is getting better. And the expectations are getting more solidified. So what the next billion is now expecting is actually those fundamental principles applied with an amount of consistency, with an amount of finesse. You're entering a new window where it's not just about understandability, which we can get into in just a second, but you're also looking at a new age of finesse in design, which is, I'm certain if you look around the block.
Something that's come to my mind is proactive design.
Yeah.
So can you just share a bit about that with us?
We're really big fans of that here at Canvas. Thing that you're now going to see a lot more of is where design and product take the forefront of actual business experiences. So what do I mean by this? A fundamental banking homepage that we've been used to for so long in India is just a bento box model where you have a bunch of options placed out there. Not saying that that's going anywhere anytime soon. It has its place business-wise, but you're now going to see a lot more with regards to what really matters to a user to better inform them on the domains that their product exists in. So for instance, for the longest time, if you look at let's take a British example, I have a Monzo account, and with Monzo, it is a British banking, neo-banking.
Okay.
Now, they've already kind of like gone so further into that process of thinking about the product. When you land into the actual product, what you first see is a spends and budgeting tool, which then leads into your accounts and deposits, right? You're proactively taking a person through the experience of understanding their money. And those actually, at the end of the day, help make better sales, because if you understand your money better, you also know which way you need to go with it. And I'll very shortly put what the benefits of this are, is that it informs people far more on what it is they're even looking at. Having a savings account, I don't think people even at a large level understand what that is, or what the implications of one are. I barely get it. And I'm starting to understand only now because you've researched more into the details of it. When you place those out as actual usable design elements on screen, you're informing a person better. And in the domain we work in finance, people always buy, people always do, people always act best when they're informed.
You also actually mentioned resource constraint being one of the factors in India. Can you share an example, someone who's actually leveraged design within these constraints?
Okay, one thing we learned when designing out budgeting tools is that you have to work with the positive framing as opposed to the negative. Now, I'll take the same Monzo example I brought up. When you use up an amount of money, the way it's framed in it, because of an individualistic Western culture, is that you've spent this much money.
Okay.
It's a very pro-credit, very pro-spending culture. India is not that. Notwithstanding, maybe you and I have a different sensibility on it, but India at large is not a pro-spending,
No, we're a saving
very
economy.
big.
Yeah.
So you don't mention even fundamental language things, a UX copy piece. I'm not even going to get deeper than that. The design of the copy is that budget used as opposed to money spent was something that we saw visceral reactions and visceral difference in reaction.
So which one did people react?
Budget used was positively looked at
And
as
money
opposed to money spent.
So it led to less.
Basically, the money leaving you as opposed to the fact that I've budgeted this much. It's a simple semantics thing.
Yeah.
It's just semantics. It has nothing to do with. It's the same thing.
Okay.
But you semantically have shifted the perspective. It's a glass half full, glass half empty, I would say, kind of thing. I'm not going to say which one is which. I have no idea. But those kinds of things really feed into the cultural attitudes of like what the country is all about. It's a big part of.
I know exactly what you're talking about, because when we were launching the Play Points program, we actually did a very deep user research study where we took the prototypes of the US, the previously launched markets that we had. And, there were things that I never thought people would react to, but exactly what you said, just a terminology meant something so different in India versus what it meant in the West.
I have another example, again, in semantics. Now, I know this is not all design specific, but it is design at the end of the day. Mental health modules in, let's just say, a health platform. The words received not in the most, notwithstanding a younger group of people accepting and understanding what it is.
But there's always.
There is a older group of people who look at it as essentially all things considered a psychopathic person, which is unfortunate. But the problem is then you have to play the game correctly so that people actually use tools that help them in their psychological struggles. So you have to go for mindfulness. You need to go for well-being. You have to avoid the word mental. Because mental in itself is a polemic. It's essentially a negative word in itself. It's a pejorative where ye to mental hai, which you don't want to consider these kinds of low common denominator pieces, but it kind of harkens back on the same thing that you have to consider it. It's the reality of a lot of people and you have to respect it and work accordingly.
The other thing very specific now that started to come to India is apps that are coming up in regional languages or being designed for vernac, and you're designing for tier, like the next India, right? Not India 1, but India 2 and 3.
The entire idea of how there's new design informing essentially the future of digital design here, you can look at it through the lens of maybe if you look at type foundries in the country.
I want you to first explain what is type
foundries. So a type foundry is a design firm, an organization that essentially just makes a font family, a font face. It's graphic design teams that create fonts.
Is this a company?
Yep, these are companies.
Oh, these are companies. So it's not a particular organization. This is
They're independent firms.
Okay.
So there's a bunch of guys out there. There's one company that we're working with whose primary font was actually made by a type foundry that's won a lot of awards in the past, and both Indian and international. And the name of the font is Anek, which is really well termed.
So many in English.
And they kind of hit the big, the most commonly used languages out there. So your Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, Gujarati. I think they have Hindi on there and
Bengali.
Bengali is on there. There's a couple others. They've covered the range, and they forget even looking at the digital design spectrum of things. At this fundamental level, you're seeing a lot more people considering the importance of creating a font family that's effective for digital design like UI and UX, but also works across multiple languages without breaking things too much, or works within your realm of like product without screwing things up. And that is a sign of the times that you're now going to have. There's not people, you call them India 2 and 3. I would say actually those are India 1 and 2, right? But India 1 and 2 is not going to be reading an English platform. They don't have the interest in learning English. They're going to be within whatever language they're in.
Yeah.
Right? It's a multilingual country, and in many places there isn't even a second language to lean upon, other than what you'd have in like the metropolitan areas. So the fact that type foundries are now aligning themselves according to this should indicate the sign of the time. It's a tough process, and we also, I think everyone admittedly has a tough time going into it, but it's going to turn into a principle here that you're not going to see in the West. You're not going to see as much of the principle there because most of the glyphs there are in the Latin kind of script. Here you have things that wildly change
between
from
scripts.
Like a Sanskrit to a Dravidian, huge shifts, and huge shift in size and structure. but it's going to have to become a principle. It's going to have to become a guiding principle in how we work.
Yeah. So while designing a payment platform, what are some of the things that should be kept in mind?
All right. So you want to make sure that you're designing modularly enough, particularly if you're in a fast-paced team that's like moving to market really quickly, which there is a lot of examples of that out there. You want to make sure that things are modular enough such that if you're going live and something's not necessarily in that realm of possibility just yet, you're able to take it out without things completely breaking. So you want to make sure that things have independent places there without being too codependent. There can be a lot of different smaller design features.
I will need like an example.
So, one big example is things like your user mnemonics or user kind of profile images, how those interplay with a variety of UPI IDs in a listing when they're coming out. Making sure those kinds of user modules are like well designed in a way where if an image is not able to show up or if a certain ID is not able to show up, that page can still exist as it is. It may be a lower fidelity version of what you wanted out there, but it still works without looking like a complete train wreck. That's really important. Another big hurdle that ends up happening is if you don't have an informed enough team on like what is going on in the payment space at the time, you might not design completely to the requirement of what's already out there. So you want to make sure you're at the front of the curve of what the technology can give you as an offering, as opposed to even at the middle or the back of it, which would be the worst.
Okay, and I'm going to just quickly jump into gamification. A lot of people kind of use gamification just for the sake of using gamification because it sounds cool. What are some of the pitfalls of using gamification?
So we're big fans of really questioning whether you need to even go in that direction. Not saying that gamification is a problem inherently, but there are some, let's not say pitfalls, but there are some guiding considerations. One, understanding that it is a big operational cost. One thing we've written about a little bit on our editorial team is sometimes what upper management in India, a lot more often than not, mean is visual delight.
And not necessarily
gamification.
A leaderboard or a rewards.
Because you might want the pop and wonder of a animation, which is fine, makes perfect sense.
Right.
It actually has a good place in improving experiences. You might want the variety of an illustration that comes in or a structure or layout that feels more novel, but that's not gamification. And the problem is sometimes using the misnomer there
interchangeably
takes you down a route, a whole route that doesn't lead you to, it's fool's gold.
So I think, Ala, this has been a lot of fun. And now we're going to do a fun section.
Sure.
We're going to do a rapid fire.
All right, let me sit up straight.
You have to, and you can only give me a few words.
Yeah,
okay,
sure.
And I'm going to now ask you these rapid fire questions.
Right.
Are you ready?
Absolutely.
Okay, let's go. Share a simple yet effective design tip that anyone can use to improve their user interfaces. Just one.
Okay, write well. Actually write. Don't use lorem ipsum. The quickest one. Makes your design more believable.
Okay. What is the design feature you see revolutionizing the future?
A lot more of like the calm design or the removal of design elements. Like if you're looking at people like Rabbit or Humane Pen, how do you design experiences that doesn't require a screen? How do you design the experience to be outside that?
What is the most outlandish feature any company or a team has asked you to design for?
The initial ask was not the crazy one. It was an ask about there being a new app that has come out live for a certain client, turned into something far more outlandish, which is that on every card in every part of a landing page, there was a download the app chip that got placed out, and it got placed out, I think, nearly 30 times within 3 scrolls of a page. It ended up turning into quite a parody of itself. Thankfully, we've gotten past those days, but yeah, that was quite absurd.
So what is the first thing you do when you hit a roadblock in your design process?
One thing you definitely want to do, because there is a visual element to the entire thing, is shut off from the work for a quick second.
Okay.
Mull
Shut
over
off.
on it. Yeah, so that's
fine.
the big one.
If you would credit one thing that makes all the hard work worth it, what would it be?
This is a very specific to designer kind of thing, but there is a material element to doing work in this space. So when you get done with the process, regardless of how it is when it goes live, that material thing of just having that thing in your hands that you've just created.
Okay. So the output that you finally
even
create
to yourself, yeah. Besides, before it even goes into any new stuff, just that first output's always a good feeling.
Any pet peeves in the design journey?
I think this links back to a previous one, is putting in a lot of placeholder, not trying to make things realistic. Like lorem ipsum, huge pet peeve for me.
Okay.
Or repeating icons, I hate them.
Okay. Now, this part is where I want to get to know you a bit better. So I'm going to ask some questions to just like understand who's Alad and
Yeah,
Alad,
sure.
the designer. What are the 3 things you think one should do to become a principal designer?
Learn to present design better. So that means design communication and conversation. Learn to talk to people and meet middle grounds better. It really pays to be pragmatic.
Okay.
And sometimes that means taking the back foot on certain items, understanding where to take the back foot, really important.
And the third one?
The last one I would say is understand context switching between different teams. So you're going to be speaking slightly different talk between when you speak to your designer team versus when you speak to a product team. Learn how to context switch well enough. You're not going to be talking the same talk with every group.
A career hack that you have used in your journey?
I guess as you grow older into your career, not that I'm very old in my career, but the more you grow into it, don't shy away from handing over certain work to people as you go ahead. I think in the Indian work culture, there's this inherent guilt with not working, but it's not inherently lazy to delegate well. It's actually you opening up space for higher order operations in the day.
Yeah.
So learn to
Delegate.
hand over and delegate better. It's a big hack.
That's a good one. 7 years of work experience. How do you start this journey?
Okay, that's an interesting question because it's very different now than it was then. So I think it takes back to the initial point of imitation. If you're just starting, you're entering kind of a bit of a Kafkaesque place where people want 5 years of experience for a first year, designer. Spend a lot of time imitating other case studies and actually trying to work on case studies that involve both design and writing.
Okay.
Don't just show me a dribble redesign of what Play Store or Spotify need to look like. Write about a problem statement and design that out accordingly. Show that you can be a consequential designer in a team for whatever purpose it is. And there's multiple ways to look consequential. You're either capable in the tech side of things, you're capable in understanding product strat, you're capable in just understanding visuals, but write about that as well.
Okay. I think this has been great, Alad. It was really fun chatting with
thank you. Yeah, likewise.
And just looking forward to seeing what canvas and you are going to be putting out there.
We're at the ground floor, I think, of something really exciting with our team. So, yeah, I'm excited too.
Same here. Thank you.